So hello, everybody. Welcome to those who are here. Our sort of normal tradition is that I do a little intro. This is not part of the LF, but if you've been in LF calls, I think most of us have the disclaimer around antitrust. We're all working in the open. These meetings are public. They're recorded and posted to YouTube. All that applies. And we usually do a round of intros for folks who've not been here at least 2 times. So if you are new to this call, I'd love to hear from you if you want to. And please add yourselves, if you're so inclined, to the list of attendees that Ed is projecting right now. Hearing nobody, and I'm going to just move on.
So this is Simpson Garfinkel, and I'm an invited guest, and I don't have the ability to put myself on the list of attendees. But
this is
you can
perfectly
have me
acceptable.
if you wish.
Okay. Great to have you.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Can we hear from Jay? I mean, you got a new team member. Let's pump up the volume.
Want to introduce yourself, share any background?
Oh, sure, yeah. I'm Jay. I'm the new PM on the team. We'll be working on all things Open Source Security Foundation. I came from VMware, where I was their sole director of technology risk advisory. Before that, I'm not going to give you the whole history. Spent a long time in the military, came out and did a whole bunch of stuff until I got here. Shrug.
That's perfect. That's great. Glad you're here. So for today, I guess about 3 weeks ago, we began tick-tocking or flip-flopping between specs and code discussions. Today is a spec-focused call. And Ed kindly put together a very detailed agenda for us. This is sort of just pulling out, it looks like a lot of the past conversations we've had, things that didn't quite come to resolution. I hope some of these can be pretty quickly closed. So I would like to propose we move a couple around, specifically the sort of middle section of discussion decision, gitref versus gitoid, tree versus DAG, naming GitBOM or just BOM. I'd love to start with those 3 because I feel like they'll be pretty quick decisions to make.
Okay. So I'm more than happy to move those forward. I actually had something of an instinct to move those forward myself.
Okay.
But there was a little bit of a stream of consciousness, and actually these things go into the spec section.
Yeah. I think the next most important things are the spec licensing. Everyone had an action item to go check with your council, bring things back. Hopefully that's just a quick check-in. And if folks want to further delay that another 2 weeks, I don't think that's the end of the world. And then I'd love to get to the rule of 2. I think that's going to be one of the most important ones for the folks who are doing the coding to have a consensus on the rule of 2. The other stuff is also important, but I think that's a blocker for some folks.
Before or after the spec scope proposal?
Just after the spec scope.
Okay.
Does anyone else have other suggestions or requests? Going once, going twice.
Why are you fighting me, Word? Not Word, Google. Okay, I will come back to the actual physical movement. We may just follow the agenda.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, and our opening topic of just a reminder for everyone to reach out to various languages and build tool communities. We have a spreadsheet to track some of those. That's more on the, well, yeah, I guess that's a regular thing in both our meetings. Let's run through that real quick, see if we have any updates.
Sure. I actually have one from the Node community now that I think about it.
Wonderful.
I talked to some of the folks in the Node community last week, and I forgot to ask if I could put them on the spreadsheet, so I won't put their on there by name.
I have an email sitting in my outbox, my drafts folder, honestly, to the OCI team, left over from last week that I need to send.
Yeah, so basically, they're kind of, in the conversation I had with them, they're sort of very interested in the possibility, given the dynamism of what actually gets, of the way that Node requires and imports things, being able to capture the time-oriented evolution of the GitBOM tree of the actual Node instance, and at least log it, if not make it programmatically available to Node itself. Struck them as potentially quite interesting around a variety of sort of issues they have with runtime security.
Nice. One tangentially related but kind of fun update. I spent last week at ShmooCon. It's a security conference in Washington, D.C. And I walked the idea of a GitBOM up and down the hallways. Had a lot of really good reactions from folks who work on data forensics and incident response, blue teams at some big consulting companies. They're all like just jumping up and down with like, yes, please, when can I have this? So a good proof point that we're onto something when all the security teams are like, this would absolutely help me fix log4shell the next time it happens faster.
Awesome. So it's always good to get feedback one way or the other, but it's happy when it's good feedback.
Yeah.
Cool. But if folks could think of other communities and or contact points they'd like to get engaged with, that's fine. I know you had mentioned, I think, something about Scala, Dave, from previous occasions. I don't know if anything came of that yet.
Nothing has come out of either Scala or the broader JVM community. I did invite Ilya from Docker to join us. He won't join us this week, but he might next. He's
awesome.
He's actually fingers on keyboard for a lot of their security stuff. So you know, Justin and company, awesome. Talk to them, make sure that they're strategically aligned. But you know, I bias towards people who sling code, and Ilya is doing that.
Wonderful.
Awesome. Cool.
I've also had some conversations with the Sneak folks, so that may we may be able to get them involved. That's kind of a long, slow roll. Yeah. And yeah, I guess I should just, like, after this meeting, go ping some of my Scala friends and say, hey, let's get this into the simple build tool or something and see where that takes us.
I'm chatting also with Sneak and with some more Google folks, just trying to get the Google security teams involved.
Okay. Maybe offline we can coordinate on who you're talking to at Sneak and who I am.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Awesome.
Ed, do you want to take it away?
Yeah, I can sort of at least start. So, and by the way, if there are other things that folks would like to discuss, please propose them. The only reason I sort of put a bunch of items in here is just so we don't lose track of them. And so we have something to sort of, you know, provide a little bit of structure and direction, not because I'm particularly attached to the structure and direction. But I think the first thing that came up, which has been sort of hanging out for a while, is replacing gitref with gitoid and the documentation, spec, etc. Basically, right now, it was pointed out to us, I think by Santiago originally, or at least he was the firmest about it, that it's probably better to talk about them as git object IDs or gitoids rather than as gitrefs, to be in a little bit better alignment with the way that Git documents itself. And so this was raised, as you see, some time ago. We've occasionally discussed it, but we haven't actually come to a conclusion on it. So I didn't feel terrifically good about going and sort of submitting a patch to slam the entire site over terminology-wise until we had some consensus.
Does anyone have an objection to that change?
Behind you.
No objection. I was going to say I'm in favor of this.
I am too, and I'm personally at fault for needing to fix it to begin with. So awesome.
Elliot?
Well, let me tell you about how this gets perceived when you try to explain this stuff to people who don't know about it.
Okay.
The first thing, and Ed's been witness to this, I don't want to say dozens of times, but quite a lot. There's already enough mix-up between Git and the rest of this that aligning language further with Git doesn't exactly strike me as appealing, to be honest. Every time I socialize this, people immediately think that we're always talking about Git, the protocol, Git, the web, GitHub, the website. Well, where's the check-in? Where's the fork? Where's the this? And they immediately, their brain takes a left turn. Right, it's a problem that with the terminology, and we're borrowing just this much out of Git, like really just this much, and things really take a left turn because of that. So before you go aligning technology, I'd ask that you take a good think about that. And I'm sure each and every one of the other people on the call has had this exact same problem, by the way.
Jeremy, you've got your hand up as well?
Yeah, I've been thinking along similar lines, like, what is the significance of Git in this project? And like, there's immense value, I think, in being able to use Git OIDs to identify specific leaf artifacts, and like being able to say, here I have this BOM, I can scan my repos and find out, exactly how these artifacts correspond to things that I've got committed. But aside from some implementation details about how the Merkle tree is constructed and so on, there isn't really a lot of commonality with Git. And so I think the Git branding helps in some way, in that it kind of at least puts people in the right frame of mind about what level this system is operating at. But I kind of agree with Elliot saying that, it is a bit of a distraction, because almost all of the aspects of Git that people really think about are irrelevant to this. Like, we're talking about really technical internal details of Git that only true experts really understand at all, that is common with GitBOM.
Mm-hmm. I'm saving my comments. Jeff, your hand.
But also, and just one other tiny thing, at Meta, we don't use Git. We use a sort of thing that's closest to Mercurial. And so, like, I added a point down in the rule of two section, but, to what extent do we want to support non-Git identifiers? Because, not everyone uses Git.
So I support both. I support all positions. Let me say it this way. When it comes to scoping between gitref and gitoid, that is separate from, I think, the conversation that Elliot and Jeremy are bringing up. I think that the point they're bringing up is super important, but gitref versus gitoid still has get in it. So I feel like we've broadened the scope, perhaps, from a change from one meaning within how Git is implemented to another. And from that perspective, I think gitoid is more clear, and so I support that change. I do wonder if the conversation that we're having with Jeremy and Elliot, because I support that as well, is another conversation that we should have outside of this specific change here. Really the basis of this implementation is on a Git hash, a hash implemented specifically the way that Git does it. And so is it a question of better clarification in the spec, in the website, of keeping people's brains from turning left immediately? Or is it really that because we started here, we're never going to be able to get past this problem? I think that's a worthwhile conversation to have.
Thank you, Jeff. Great framing. And pretty much what I was going to respond with as well. So does anybody have, between gitref and gitoid, right, not broadening the conversation for the moment, Any strong feelings that we should stick with gitref? Hearing no dissent, let's go for gitoid for now, and then have the bigger conversation of, is the fact that we're relying on an underpinning of Git that I agree only Git experts or developers who are writing and contributing to Git itself understand. We've all had to do lots of disambiguation here. The website even opens with that disambiguation for a reason. That's a conversation that I suppose is worth having, but I'm concerned, to be frank, that simply having that conversation will risk derailing a lot of the project's work. Ed and I chose, started this a year ago-ish, to stick to building off of what already exists with Git because of the accelerant that gives this project and its ability for being adopted widely, knowing that not everybody uses Git, but enough places do, that there's a really good synergy there.
I think we've got Jeremy's hand up again.
No, sorry, that was left over.
So let's come back to that later. I want to try and get through as much of these points.
So, and for everyone else, I have captured this in the new conversation list below, because we have this wonderful habit of uncovering other interesting topics as we go. Yep. And so I wanted to make sure we capture them if we're going to split the conversation off.
Thank you. Thank you for capturing that. Next decision, do we replace tree with DAG? I'll take the same format here. Does anybody have a strong objection to that small change?
So I'm overall supportive of the change. The things that are rumbling through my mind are how to represent it in a somewhat familiar way to folks. Because while it's 100% true that we're talking about a DAG and not a tree, a couple of things come to mind. One is that people can, by analogy, reason in their heads about a tree more readily. The other one that comes to mind is that when you begin trying to graphically represent things, DAGs can become somewhat messy to represent. They start looking much more like generalized graphs, which also is somewhat less communicative. So I'm wholly in favor of moving to using DAG as the primary term. I just want us to be mindful of how we sort of keep the communication at a more accessible level as we go.
Yes. Jeff, I see your hand back up.
Yeah, and I think I share the same concerns that you have. In the same way we just talked, a parallel would be only folks who understand Git implementation details understand the nuance of that conversation we just had. Only folks who understand the nuance of this concept that we're currently calling GitBOM would understand how that tree can then be represented as a DAG. So for the introduction to the concept, I think we still need a discussion of things like artifact trees. And so we need to be careful that we're articulating both that it can be a tree in some discussions and it can be a DAG in others.
So I'd like to offer the perspective that Git itself, if you dive into its developer docs or its sort of internals documentation, is very specific, very precise and accurate in its terminology. And most folks never do. Most folks interact with Git through a sufficient abstraction that they don't have to think about the DAG or the gitoid. And what we're trying to build with GitBOM would, I believe, eventually have that same level of abstraction where the tools make this basically invisible or nearly invisible to most developers. They might interact with it insofar as a blue teamer searching for something by a reference, which could be a tag, it could be a hash, a reference, a gitoid, or some other mechanism that could just cross-reference. Here's a CVE, now pull up anything in my environment that has a vulnerability connected to that. And they don't need to see how it's connected, which is the gitoid and things like that. So we're in the weeds right now with a lot of very technical terms that we are borrowing from Git because that is the basis for the underlying storage of this. I think once we get past this early phase, we'll see a lot of that abstracted away by the tools.
Would it make sense for me to go? Sorry, go ahead, Elliot.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I just disagree that Git is the underlying basis here. I think we're borrowing a couple of concepts. The underlying basis here is a secure hash. Everything else is bonding, and I think we just have to be careful about over rotating on Git in this regard, because later it's going to come back to bite you, especially if you want to diverge from something that Git's doing, which you may.
Dave?
So what Jeff said really resonates. And there's always the precision versus adoption curve. In other words, if you make something easier to adopt, that's good. If you make it more precise at the cost of adoption, that's not good. So, I mean, what we can do is we can talk about trees, because in a substantial number of cases, we are looking at trees. It is only the case that we're looking at DAGs as we go across, multiple projects, but on each individual project, you're going to be looking at a tree. So we might say tree and tree-like structures in the documentation with, an asterisk that says, DAGs are not formally trees because you can have shared nodes. But for the most part, it is a tree. And conceptually, you can think about it as a tree. So maybe I'm baby splitting here, but the tree language feels okay, except when you're in the weeds. I don't know. Does that all make sense, or am I just like babbling like I often do?
No, I think I understand your point.
I think I understand your point.
No.
Ease of adoption and technical accuracy. I take that one to heart quite a lot.
You were going to say something, Jeremy?
Yeah, I was going to say, like, for the spec, I think this is not end user documentation. I think technical correctness trumps everything in the context of the spec. And in particular, our initial audience is going to be the people who are implementing GitBOM in their tooling. And so those people have to be aware of this distinction and have to be like clear about what the difference between a DAG and a tree is. And it's not correct that we're talking about a trees within the scope of a single project. Like if you use the same input, like if you build a library and then use it for 2 executables within the same project, you have a DAG. So you need to have, you need to have precision at every level. I think later on, when we're talking about end users who are trying to understand why their package, why they have the security alert against a package or something like that, then we can be looser about the language. And in particular, we don't really care about the entire structure of a GitBOM. We care about the specific path between a, buggy library and their executable or whatever. And there might be multiple paths, but we just pick one and say, this is why we're flagging your binary. And whether it's because we walked a path through a tree or a DAG is not really relevant at that level. So I think at the level that we're discussing, our audience is an audience that is going to understand the distinction between tree and DAG. And unlike the difference between Git and a sort of more generic terminology, like DAG is just standard computer science. I would not expect people to be confused by that terminology.
I've lost track a little bit of the order of who raised their hands when, but I think Vicky was next.
No,
What?
I believe it was
Nope.
Simon, Jeff, and then Vicky. Does that sound right to folks?
Okay, good. Sorry, I misperceived. Go ahead, Simon.
I'm sorry, did you say Simpson?
Yes.
No, Simon.
You are.
My name's
Dave.
Simpson.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. I misscanned. Apologies.
That's
sorry,
okay.
Simpson. I'm far away from my screen. I'm so sorry about that.
I just wanted to say that, I put a few things in the chat because I didn't want to talk, but I guess that nobody was monitoring the chat. I think technical correctness is always a thing that you want to do, especially early in a project. Terminology is exceedingly important to have perfect. There's more time in the future of the project than in the past, so you always want to get the terminology correct, especially early on. And if the terms are confusing, you can create your own term that will describe precisely the object or the class that you're using in your thing. You could call it a queue and then say a queue is a DAG, but have that be for this particular case. That's all I wanted to say.
It's good sound advice, actually.
Jeff,
I
and
think-
then
I support that. I think the question we could refine. Right now, it's replace tree with DAG in documentation /spec, etc. I think the proposal we're coming up with is to use DAG in the spec because of how important that terminology is, and then provide some guidance around that in documentation such as the website on how DAGs and trees relate, because it comes back to, are you looking at the tree or are you looking at the forest? And we can provide that kind of guidance in the website.
yeah. I like that.
Yeah, so I mostly wanted to plus one that I think that specifically Jeremy and David's comments around audience are very important here. I mean, the audience for this is a specification, and so we should be as precise as possible. And so Jeremy's point on that is really valid, but David's point about, making sure that, technically correct is the most, the best kind of correct, right? Yes, but if it ruins usability, then it's not, right? So in the documentation, it will be a different thing, but the specification has a very, specific audience.
Very nice audience, yeah.
Right, and so, DAG, if this is technically a DAG, then yes, I think that's certainly the way it should be in the spec. But the documentation, that's a different creature, different audience. We can handle it differently there.
Okay. So I think I'd like to wrap up this section. So I think we had a lot of really good feedback, and it sounds like consensus. Almost all of us feel that using a DAG and the terminology around a DAG in the spec, given the audience of that, is the right call. And then adding more guidance to documentation, both on the website and end user docs when we get there, around what that really means, and calling it a tree kind of loosely where that increases accessibility for new users or new contributors down the road. I think we all agree on that as well. Fair summary?
Mm-hmm.
Great, cool, thank you all. Moving on. Directory name, .bomb versus .gitbom. This becomes another big compatibility thing for folks as they're doing proof of concepts right now. We might want to chain some of those POCs together to demonstrate how that could work. We've got to have the directories named the same thing. In our last discussion, we all agreed on the directory structure being first two characters followed by 38. But we need the name of the directory to be the same.
So I think that we may want to postpone this slightly because the actual implementers involved on the ground, where some of the suggestions around this have been coming from,
yeah.
For reasons having to do with one-time conflicts, are not here today. And so we may want to defer that particular discussion. Although it looks like we have more hands up again. Simpson, is your hand still up, or is it up again?
No, I need to lower it.
Okay. I did see Jeremy's hand go up, but I just want to comment here in case it preempts and saves time. I'm perfectly happy to move this one back to GitHub and just poll people to get their commentary on it. Jeremy, go ahead.
I mean, this just seems very deep in the implementation weeds. Like, is this something that is part of the spec, or is it part of a like particular kind of like implementation guidance? Or?
It needs to be part of a consistency between all implementations of tooling around this, so that if I'm getting a project that has a GitBOM that's been built by one tool and I'm going to use a different tool on it now, because different language ecosystem or different compiler, I have to still be able to find that directory. And if we don't give everyone common guidance, it's just going to kind of make a mess.
So go ahead. Sorry, go ahead, Del.
Very quickly, I am strongly in favor of calling it something besides .gitbom because I found it's way too confusing with the .git directory for a project that uses Git. I don't want to get into the Git tied to Git, not tied to Git discussion, but I would like to not be confused on that.
Tab completion.
Yes.
For tab completion's sake, I don't want to use .gitbom
And Git
either.
ignore. Yeah.
Yes, yes.
So, okay, so framing it as we did earlier, like of the choice between BOM and GitBOM, I definitely prefer BOM, or at least not .git, just because of that particular confusion that Nell's talking about. As far as the larger scope goes, though, it seems to me like there is a distinction between the sort of more theoretical, like how you construct one of these BOMs, and like if I were building an algorithm from scratch, how would I reproduce these particular results? And then there's the sort of like very practical concerns about, given that we have these, you know, we want tools to interoperate, what mechanism should they interoperate by? And they, I don't know. I mean, I understand that it's like introducing just complexity. The trouble is that those details just don't work in a lot of environments. Like having a directory where people are dumping files. Like there's a very specific kind of environment in which that works, which is not universal.
So could I ask a quick question then? Could you give maybe a different example? Because I absolutely agree that it's not universal. But I was thinking about this in terms of when one is in a build environment where a tool writes an output artifact, reads an input artifact from a file system and writes an output artifact to a file system, which is often, not universally, but often the case. That was kind of the context in which I was thinking of it in. Are you thinking of something?
If you're doing a distributed build in which every input and output needs to be explicitly enumerated so that when you set up a build environment, all the right inputs are there, then like having a .bomb directory kind of implies that you have to treat the entire directory as an input and an output, which could be done, but it's not very efficient, particularly if it gets large. So like it kind of assumes a very small scale build environment, which you're doing the entire build on one machine and one directory.
Yeah. I mean, nothing prevents it from being a network folder or propagated between build steps. I think your point is interesting that some environments just don't have a local directory to store that in. Is that the sort of meta point?
Essentially, or synthesizing a local directory in that way can be kind of expensive.
Interesting. What other mechanism would such environments use to store and synthesize this kind of information?
So for a Bazel or Buck build, you would just need to declare every single artifact as a explicit input or output. And that's tricky if the artifact names are computed by the build steps themselves. So it's a big conversation. I mean, all I'm really flagging is that we should treat it as a big conversation, not like just as a given that this is the design, because
yeah, and the reason I was asking for specifics was particularly I was looking for threads that could be pulled in between meetings to go look at specific examples, and those are excellent ones.
Yeah. And Simpson added a good one in the chat as well. But I want to honor the order of hands and jump to Frederick next, then Vicky and David, and then Simpson. What we thought would be a quick discussion has turned into a long one, which is great. There's a lot of.
Yeah, so I think that when we take a look at it, if we have a local directory, then we should definitely specify some standard, and we could say the standard is BOM. I would recommend instead of having BOM objects, I would recommend saying like bomb slash and then something that specifies it, that it's like a GitBOM style object there, because I suspect in time we'll start to see other groups start to add their own type of metadata into it. Like we'll see SPDX, or we'll see CycloneDX, or other similar types of future things get created there. Or we may also see metadata that is GitBOM related, but not GitBOM, also possibly land within that directory structure over time. I don't think we should mandate the use of a directory though. So for example, if I'm doing a distributed build, those, as mentioned before, I may choose to inline those as part of the request response, or I may choose to store those within some type of a database, or I may even put them inside of some queue where whatever is consuming that queue may decide on what it wants to do with those particular artifacts in the long run. So I think the flexibility is there, and we say that the standard place to place this is, and then we list out what that standard should look like. So it ends up being a standard, but not necessarily a strict requirement that this is the one and only way to do so.
There's an interesting overlap with a bunch of, and someone really has a strong echo, by the way. I don't know who it is. I'm looking around to see whose mic is lighting up, and I don't see any mic lighting up, and it's not mine.
Sounds better now.
But that was, thank you for muting. There's some teams in Microsoft doing, I think it's the Terrapin team doing .NET builds, and I know the Debian folks with build info files who are capturing a lot of the same kind of environment metadata we've been talking about in their own folder or their own way. It might not be a folder. So I'm fine leaving this one as flexible and open with a little bit of guidance, given that it's going to change. My sense on this is as more build communities get involved, we're going to realize this one in particular, a lot of folks are already doing stuff that we want to be able to have flexibility with. I saw Vicky, David, and then Simpson.
I will try to go quickly because I know we've got a lot to cover. You know, huge plus one to Nell's point, as they pointed out, you know, just a .git anything is going to be a royal pain in the butt, right? So, you know, minus that, but I'm also minus bomb because there are so many other bomb things. So finding some other way aside from .gitbom or .bomb, I think would be better, because otherwise, to me, I show up to this and I see it out of nowhere, and this implies to me that all of the bombs go there, whatever bomb type thing there might be, which is not the case here. So we need to make sure we are not confusing people who come across it, so they know exactly what's in there. And I'll shut up now and defer to David.
So Vicky and I disagree on this one. I actually like bill of materials. And this is an instance of bill of materials that is different from SPDX or some of the other standards, but it is a bill of materials. So I'm biased towards referring to it that way. I'm also 100% in the you don't need Git, and maybe we can start looking at where we remove from the branding, etc. In terms of the output of a build session or whatever, I view the directory as simply a database. It's, you basically have an index into the database based on the hash, and that gives you more information about what, the metadata, et cetera, associated with the hash. So would it be possible to actually do something like, okay, here's how you do it if you have a writable directory. Here's a JSON data structure that represents the same thing, except it's a big old JSON blob. And there might be 2 or 3 or 4 other manifestations of the database indexed by hash that could be output from various different build tools with whatever the restrictions are. So that's kind of my thought and reaction. With all that being said, look, I suck at naming. So if somebody else comes up with a better idea or there's consensus, just go with it.
So thinking about what my earlier point, and like David touched on exactly the same thing, which is like if tools emitted a single file, JSON file containing all of the BOM content, then that would work much better for the environments that I'm talking about. And then if there were a standardized way of exploding that JSON out into a directory tree for other things to consume, then that would perhaps address all of these issues. And there's a bit of a chat channel conversation going on, but I suggested tool BOM as a name, since the essence of this project, as I see it, is it's BOM-like structures being generated by the tool chains themselves rather than some external process.
Citizen's hand was next, by the way.
Sorry.
Should I go?
Yep, go for it.
Okay. So I built a system similar to this at Census, and we completely separated the data abstraction from the data storage layer. And I recommend that you do that. And I'm a bit confused of which you're talking about right now. So for data storage layer, we had multiple data storage engines that could store artifacts in files, for example, in the current directory or in a directory specified by an environment variable, or it could store it in a local SQL database or a local Mongo database or in S3 objects. And we defined the API that the database had to do, which was similar to the Git database API. You know, basically, here's a hash, give me stuff related to the hash, a big dictionary, and then with some lineage capabilities and signed transactions. So separately from that, you have the data model and the clean API between the data model and your object storage. And so I'm really confused whether you're talking now about the object store system or about something else.
So that gets to an excellent point. So part of it is that one of the things that's going to be true about this is we are going to need to get very small changes into a bunch of different build tools. So we've got POC work already for LLVM, Clang, and LLD. Obviously, we'd want to be involved in GCC. Obviously, we want to be part of the various Java compilers, the ASM tool in Java, and a bunch of other things. So one of the things that we're going to need to work out is the smallest possible, the smallest, simplest thing we can ask those build tools to do. And then we need to figure out if there are other connective tissues involved. So just as an example, going back to your point, Jeremy, where you were saying this would be so much easier for you if you could dump it out as a single file. And there are lots of places where that's absolutely going to be true. You know, there are pluses and minuses to single fileness from time to time, depending on what you're doing and who's involved. But there are places where that's going to be true. The real question becomes, is that something that is best accommodated by saying, look, if you're a compiler, compilers typically live at the level of a file system in most places. They may be living in a broader context like a Bazel build or a Buck build. And then oh, please.
I'd really like to respond to what you just said. If the purpose of this discussion is to figure out the easiest way to get something into existing build tool chains, then you really should survey those people and find out. My hunch, which may or may not be correct, is that the simplest thing to get into a build chain is going to be a library with a clean API. You're not going to tell them, oh, create a directory with this name and start writing stuff. You're going to give them a complete implementation. And that implementation may have the option of sending stuff to the database. It's going to implement that same switch that I talked about. And that implementation is going to consist of at least two parts. The top level interface where the build tool saves information, and the bottom interface where that information gets persisted. And maybe that information just gets tagged and put into the data flow for the build tool. Maybe the build tool is not allowed to create local files. So again, I think that in terms of engineering something that can have wide adoption, you're working with the wrong interfaces here.
Simpson, just to give you some back context here, this meeting series and all of the various connections we have and conversations between meetings for the past several months, we are working with a lot of the folks in build tool ecosystems or in the actual teams that maintain those build tools to get their feedback already. So I appreciate your feedback that we should be, but we are and have been. I don't know if you have that context or not.
That's great. Again, in terms of having maintained systems like that, I would just want to have a clean interface rather than have to make all of these decisions or even be aware of them.
It will also vary somewhat based on language. So a C library would certainly be something potentially consumable by LLVM and GCC because they're C language things. The Java people obviously will need a Java library. The Go people will need a Go library.
Rust will need a Rust library. Maybe C, Rust is preferred.
I suspected as much, but I wasn't quite as familiar with that community. Thank you for speaking up on that point. The JavaScript, the Node.js people, I'm not even sure what they're going to want in that regard.
Our focus isn't building that single library because there isn't going to be a single library, but trying to understand and define what are the things which need to be done by a domain-specific library.
Does that make sense at all to your point, Simpson?
So it makes a lot of sense, and I appreciate the clarification. Certainly, the majority of those languages that you mentioned could work with a loaded C library because they all have cross-language call facilities, and then you would have to create some. And if they have implementations in other languages, I assume you've already decided whether the binary databases will be compatible between them. And from the very beginning, you're going to have like regression tests to make sure that all the libraries are bug for bug in sync. It's going to be, from my experience, I'd rather go with something with C bindings, which you can call a C library from almost any one of those languages that you mentioned, even JavaScript. And then if they need to start replacing it with native libraries, you'll be able to do that.
Yeah, I think the acceptability would vary wildly, I think, by community. I know, for example, like I'm fond of mentioning to folks who are looking at Seago is hell, and there's a whole blog Dave Cheney wrote about how Seago is not actually Go, which is probably a more politic way to put it. Having had the misfortune of having to play with JNI, I wouldn't wish that on my worst enemy. I realize there are places and times, and having the ability to do so is crucial.
But then you're going to need to have
.NET folks as a C library. I'd much rather have those folks get a spec and get to implement it themselves.
But you're going to need to have the regression tests, and you're going to need to decide if it's binary compatibility or API compatibility.
We are going to need down the road, and it's a great point, that is way down the road from where we are today. To have a compatibility test for different languages, different build tools, to verify these things. Excellent point. But
if I could,
for the horse for today's conversation.
If I could make an unfortunately slightly short-circuiting shift of conversation because we're running low on time. There's a lot of links in here to a lot of stuff. Some of them were entertaining, of which I should have provided an appropriate link to something about the GitBOM stuff and the tree versus DAG. It would be probably very apropos for folks to explore some of the links here to PRs or issues and comment there between meetings so we can carry the conversation forward in meetings.
Yes.
The other thing I would suggest is we have a real bias so far as a community towards conversations in Slack. And I am an enormous fan of conversations in Slack, but they don't terribly persist well. And so if we could at least move some of the outcomes of those conversations or some of the back and forth in those conversations into issues or PRs against the repo. And again, we've linked to lots of these things here. That would be enormously helpful, because what I think we're discovering is we have an embarrassment of riches when it comes to expertise and perspectives, and a paucity of time on call.
And in parallel, we are I feel reaching an inflection point where more folks are hearing about this, getting involved, and bringing in really valuable connections and perspectives, but not able to pick up the context and the back history as quickly as certainly those of us who've been doing this for almost a year now wish that that was there. So with that, I think we're almost out of time.
11:56, we got 4 minutes.
4 minutes. We're not going to have time for the last spec conversation, but I did want to switch that for 3 of those 4 minutes and say, has anybody had feedback from your respective council that this is not going to fly? Any problems surfaced with the JDF spec proposal and the split out that Ed did for the scope? Has anybody reviewed either of these yet?
So I've consulted my counsel on JDF, and their off the cuff was they've worked with JDF before, they're happy with it, followed by the traditional let me go examine everything thoroughly and come back to you. And 2 days later they came back still happy.
Oh,
so
good. Wonderful. Okay. Has anybody else had a chance to have your counsel look at these?
We have limited time and our council is slow.
Okay.
So council hasn't looked at it, but I have, and I think it would be perfectly adequate. I don't think my council is going to care one way or another, except if you ask them, in which case they're going to care very much, and they don't understand open source. So yeah,
I believe we refer to this as adding value.
Yes.
Yes. Anybody else? And just popcorn right now because we're out of time.
I just have a quick question. How does one, where's the Slack URL for this?
GitBOM.dev/community. You'll find links to all the mailing list, the Slack, et cetera, up there.
Yeah, the other point I will make is if you are slightly unfamiliar with Slack, Slack has an annoying tendency for open source communities that you have to go get an invite to the overall Slack, and then you can join the channel. We've got the links for both activities here on the community page.
It's
So
also
right
at
through
the top of the agenda of the Google Doc.
Ooh, suppose that would also be a handy pointer. Yes, it is.
That I think is just the actual join, not the invite link.
The invite link seems broken.
Yeah, and Simpson, to your question in chat, there's a lot of context and history there. Check the website. There's a whole discussion in the fact that Ed and I wrote on the point of why SHA-1 and all of that. So we did try to answer a lot of the questions that you were raising in the website. If you could read that, that'd be.
So really quick question though, before we drop, Simpson. Would you be comfortable having a CCing of the email conversation you requested to the broader GitBOM mailing list? Culturally, so far, we've not had a whole lot going on those mailing lists. And I think it would be potentially very productive to share those back and forth with the broader community, both to sort of get the mailing list going. I can go find that out for you and check with you offline. I don't think it's terribly huge.
Yeah, I want to say it's about 30 right now, but I haven't checked it in the last couple of weeks.
If it's much above 30, we will check back with you and check in. But I think you've brought up extremely good points. Some of which you know, some of which we have sort of ready-made, at least this is what we were thinking answers for. Doesn't make those answers right. But I think the conversation could be quite productive, particularly for kickstarting other conversations on the mailing list.
Yep, gitbom.dev/resources, I think, and there's a FAQ up there as well. Yeah. Awesome. Once again, thank you all. This was a really good conversation and discussion. Next week, same bat channel, same time, different topic. Next week is focused on code again and the POC we have on it. And then the one after that will be back on the spec work. And Simpson, you were not disruptive, just to be clear. Really thank you.
Oh, you were fantastic. No, much appreciated.
Yeah.
No, I was disruptive.
Well,
we've come to expect that from you, Elliot.
Yes. And please come back and disrupt us again.
Yeah, the one teaser I will throw out there is I believe that we now have the Linux kernel building with LLVM with GitBOM support.
Cool.
Yeah.